So, I see that John is here. I'm going to pull him up on the screen in a second, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about him first. So, actually, we talked about this. So, his talk today is titled 4 Lessons from 4 Companies in 4 Years. He's a senior software engineer at Facebook, and you heard me say all the other things earlier. So, let's give him a warm welcome. Hi, John.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
I can hear. There we go. Yes, I can. How are you doing?
Good, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. And yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing? Are you nervous? Are you excited? What are your main feelings right now?
I guess you're asking about this talk. I am
Yes.
a little nervous. I am excited. I think that these lessons are things that I wish I had known when I was beginning in my career and working in React. And so it's things that I'm looking forward to sharing. Some of them to me seem maybe a little bit more obvious, and I hope that people do actually find value out of it. But yeah, I am excited. Thanks for asking.
Amazing. That's wonderful because it's truly one of those things that I think it's so useful to get to speak to someone or listen to someone where they can share things that they wish they'd known at the beginning of their career. So it's wonderful that you're doing this. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Shall we get into it?
Let's do it.
Do you have your presentation? Are you going to pull it up?
Yeah, I'm going to try. I haven't used StreamYard before, so I believe I'm just going to share my screen and then present.
Okay,
So
let's
I'll
do
try
that.
that.
Okay.
But all right, well, before we do that, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. As Chrissy mentioned, my name is John Kempstead. I'm a senior software engineer at Facebook, and this title is titled 4 Lessons from 4 Companies in 4 Years. So you can infer from that I haven't been working at Facebook for more than 4 years. In fact, I've sort of been in a number of different startups that in the startup world, you find a lot of React because it's easy to build something quickly, move quickly, and get out there. And so from building things quickly, you learn a lot of lessons, things that maybe you wish you had known a year in advance. And so I'm hoping to share some of those lessons with you today from those companies. So let me see if I can share my screen here. All right. Well, all I can see is my screen. And so I'm not sure if anybody can.
I will pull it up for you.
Okay. Can you
There we go.
see? All right. Great.
Yes, we can see it. Okay, good luck.
All right, I can't see or hear anybody, so I'm just going to keep talking, but I did save a slide for some questions at the end. And also, I believe there's a Q&A after this. So looking forward to maybe some questions. But all right, so you'll see here below the title, it says a short talk about setting yourself up for success. As I was reviewing some of these lessons, I saw sort of a theme of these are all things that a year later, you kind of wish you had known to set yourself up for success. Maybe as you're building it right in the beginning, it doesn't matter so much, but a year later, you're like, oh man, I wish I had done this to begin with. So let's just start from the beginning. I will say when I first started planning this talk, I was very excited about sharing sort of a how-to coding session, but I was told by the React.js Festival, they wanted this to be more case study, where you sort of share your experience. So hope that's all right that during this talk, I plan on sharing just a few anecdotes from my personal experiences more than here's a how-to, and hope that you get some value from that. All right, so lesson number 1, use state management right off the bat. So in React, one of the main benefits of React is that instead of having this giant one JavaScript page that's some landing page we need to put all of our functions in, we're able to create state management and access variables 100 files down. So I learned this lesson when I was at the Human Diagnosis Project about 4 years ago. This was sort of earlier on when I was working in React, and this company had no state management whatsoever to begin with. They had a beautiful, wonderful website that had literally like dozens and dozens of files that would just pass down these props to another file down below, and you would have no idea where it actually came from and where it was being updated at the top. And so we made a big effort at the Human Diagnosis Project to switch everything to state management. And that was a huge undertaking, going from absolutely nothing, where we had an existing website built in place and we had everything there, to, okay, we need to instrument this whole framework and find where all these variables are coming from and create reducers and actions for everything. So over the years, there's been sort of various techniques to get around not having a system in place. And so when you go to add the system, it's not as quite simple as just easily migrating. My recommendation is, when you start a project, even though it might seem easy to avoid this, because maybe it looks like, oh, I only have a landing page. Why would I need state management? That landing page is inevitable to turn into a much bigger system that has your email system, that has a user sign-up system, that has more and more, and it gets bigger, and you'll wish that you had state management right off the bat. So I recommend that. Let's see. I will say my experience at Facebook has been really wonderful in this regard. Facebook has not only one sort of state management system set in place, but there's like 5 different state management systems. And at first you think, oh man, that's 5 different things that you have to learn. But from what I've found in learning these different state management systems is that the concepts are really all the same. Let's see, y'all. I'm going to just turn that off. A lot of the concepts are exactly the same. And so I found that if you can learn the concepts of a state management system in one place, it's easy to transfer over to the others. Even some of the proprietary systems that Facebook has created, I've been able to pick up those, and it makes a whole lot of sense. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next point. All right, strongly type everything. So some of the worst bugs that I've experienced in React tends to be where there's some sort of, after you've spent hours trying to investigate why a page isn't loading or something's breaking, or even like a site is down for some reason, there's some integer that was supposed to be a string, or there's some like just one type that was supposed to be something else. And from my experience, I've found when you make a migration from not having strongly typed JavaScript to adding in TypeScript or adding in Flow or adding in some other typed framework, you end up finding hundreds and hundreds of problems that are already existing, and it makes you wonder how the site was even working. So this is something I recommend definitely doing from the beginning. And it's very easy as like a startup or somebody who's just creating a project to say, I don't need this, it's slowing me down. I just want to write the code that I need. I know some of it might not work, and I'll add in the strongly typed language later. It's very easy to make that argument to yourself. But when you do add it in later, you're going to find so many mistakes that you made, and you'll wish that you had just started to begin with. I know at one of the companies that I was working at, Catalog, we had no strongly typed language whatsoever. And when I was brought on, one of my tasks was to work with the team to add in TypeScript to the whole application. And we had a couple people tasked to this, and they never were able to do it because they weren't able to keep up with the development. We would have had to just stop development altogether and say, okay, everybody work on this. It's one of those things that's really difficult to slowly integrate over time. And from my experience at Facebook, I've seen that they've made a very strong effort to implementing and migrating to Flow, which is the open source strongly typed system that Facebook has built. And it's been absolutely wonderful that everywhere you go, there's over 95% or so coverage of almost every file. Whenever I find that there's less than 80% of coverage, it tends to be with a third-party library that has no typing interface. And so that's actually a good point. I found that for me, it's even worth it to find these third-party libraries that don't have typing interfaces and add one yourself. I recently added one of these in Oculus platform, and it revealed a number of different misusages of this library. There's probably hundreds of them, and we're still just sort of patching those up. no real code errors that were problematic, but it was just realizing, oh my gosh, there's so many places where this is being misused, and then people end up just copying and pasting code and just replicating that same error over and over again. So this is something that I think takes a little bit of time up front, but it's totally worth it. Strongly type everything. That's something I recommend. I will say as a side note, if I'm being recruited for a company, this is something that I actually ask them about. I want to know how invested they are into strongly typed systems. And if I'm joining this company and going to be working on this code, like how ugly is it going to be? So I'm a big fan when a company says, oh yeah, we use TypeScript for everything, or we use Flow for everything. All right, let's jump on to the next lesson. Don't be afraid to create a new store. So what do I mean by this? When we're using a state management system, there tends to be an action, a reducer, a store, and that store holds anywhere between 5 and 15 variables. And those variables are then accessed from components down below through some sort of subscription. And what I found a lot of times, it can be extremely tempting as a developer when you just want to add one variable to say, okay, what's an existing store that has this variable already that I can just add it to? And that's fine when you add one variable, but then there's 20 people that end up doing that. Before you know it, you have one store that has a bunch of unrelated variables that all of your components are subscribing to these variables. I will say this is probably one of those things that's more of a personal preference than it is something that could cause system-wide failures, and it's up for debate. But in my opinion, I found that having stores with somewhere between 5 to 15 variables makes it very easy to track down where your dispatches are going, where those actions happen, how to debug something. If you need to have 2 separate applications, you can easily split them in a Redux scenario. You can have like a totally different store for that scenario, whereas in more of a Flex environment, you can just create different stores altogether. And so that's something that I highly recommend, is don't be afraid to create a new store. For a personal anecdote, I was implementing a new feature at Oculus, and I noticed that there was a feature that had been developed that had a store that had all the variables in it, and the team that was creating this new feature said, oh, well, eventually we're going to have the same variables in that store, so let's just copy it over and reference the same strongly typing that we just talked about in lesson number 2. And what ended up happening is when somebody needed to add a variable to that old system, but it wasn't relevant to the new one would then complain, hey, you're missing a variable. And vice versa, when you add something to the new one that the old one didn't need, it would complain, you're missing this variable. And so both of these stores ended up adding all these variables that probably half of them weren't relevant in the other one. And it took us a while to figure out why this was even the case. But when we figured it out, it was because when they first created the store, instead of just creating a new one that was empty and adding their variables, they tried to replicate one, thinking maybe they were thinking ahead. But that's something that is probably going to exist for a while. It doesn't cause system-wide failures, as I mentioned. It's just really an annoyance. So I recommend just go ahead and create a new store. If that means that you have to create another reducer file and another action dispatcher file, those conventions are there for a reason. And I think it's totally fine to have those files. It doesn't create more overhead of performance. Okay, let's go to this next lesson. Okay, so don't overgeneralize components. So I found that in React, one of the beautiful things about React is that components can be generalized. You used to have this huge file that had a specific object, and then a different file, it had a similar object. And now we say, well, instead of having a big JavaScript file, let's create these components, and we can build a framework out of it. So we've got React where these components are loaded in dynamically. This is wonderful, but as engineers, sometimes we tend to get a little ahead of ourselves and say, well, this specialized box actually is just a box, which just has a field, which just is a thing. And before you know it, you've got this thing component or this entity component. And I found at a number of different companies, some engineers can get a little overzealous about creating a system that is generalized to be able to do anything. And it's sort of exciting to think about that, but it ends up creating a whole bunch of confusion. And all of a sudden you're adding in a field called type in your thing component that now you're using polymorphism to load in some server-side object that tells you what type of form this is. Just scrap that whole approach. My suggestion would be just create specialized components. It is totally fine to have a really long name that says this is the specialized so-and-so form field box component. And if that's used 2 or 3 times, I think it's totally fine. You don't need to necessarily load in the box from the form from the specialized component. So in terms of some anecdotes, when I was working at IBM, I was working on a team that was creating a ticket tracking system, and we decided to make a dashboard where people could determine what tickets they wanted to see first, and they could see a graph of these tickets. And in that dashboard, we said, well, this dashboard could really be used for so many other things. What if somebody wants to track metrics for this? And every dashboard could be customized to somebody's own perspective. They could, save it for themselves. And before you know it, we had this dashboard component that had a graph component that had a box component that was a sizable component. And we were trying to make basically a visualization framework that was way overgeneralized than it was necessary for that specific task. And we ended up delaying our deliverable for it. So this is something that I recommend being careful about. I'll say even at the human diagnosis project that I was at, we were trying to encode medical information into a knowledge graph such that we could run machine learning predictions to diagnoses for medical cases. And we wanted to encode this information in a highly generalized fashion, which made sense theoretically, but when we ended up creating these components, they were just, they ended up being too generalized that it caused more confusion from an engineering perspective than it actually was able to gain value from a machine learning perspective. I will say I've been extremely pleased with my experience at Facebook in this particular regard, where we tend to have very specialized components with this really long name that at first seems a bit ridiculous, but then as an engineer, when I'm going to try to find a particular file or component, I can use Control-P or Control-H, Control-Y and start typing in my file name, and there's 6 different options, and one of them is clearly the right one that I want. It makes it very easy to find what you're looking for right in the moment, to search for examples that you can copy and paste. There's just, in my opinion, a whole lot of value here. So don't be afraid. Don't overgeneralize components. It can be quite tempting, but later on, you'll appreciate just making things specific. So, gosh, with that, those are those 4 lessons. I sort of just zoomed through that a whole lot faster than I thought I would. So I'm gonna go to questions here and see if I can not. There you go. I'm not sure if anybody was actually able to see me during that chat or if it was just the slides.
No, you were in the corner, and
oh, great, because I like using my hands. So hopefully you were able to see some of that.
No, I'm sure everyone paid attention and saw. We have a question from someone, which I might as well just ask now. What do you recommend for state management?
So for state management, I mentioned at Facebook, we've got like 4 or 5 different systems. I was a huge fan of Redux before I went to Facebook. One of the reasons I was a big fan of Redux was actually because of the convention. I think a lot of people don't like it for this reason, because you need to have basically 5 files in place in order just to get one dispatch to work. You need to have this store, you need a reducer function, you need a dispatcher function, you need a action function, you need a connect in your component. But I found that once that is in place, it actually makes it a lot easier to track down what's happening, as opposed to some of these other state management systems. It can get a little complex. So I'm a big fan of Redux. At Facebook, they've made a big push to moving towards hooks and to contexts. And when I have seen context being used, it's actually, I might be conveyed. I might be convinced to move to that side. It just, I guess for the reason it seems easy to set up. So I am worried that it's going to be hard to track down where the context is coming from and at what parent component is that provider actually being passed in. But it's very easy to set up. You can just say, create this context and add these variables. Boom, done. And then down below, access that context and use those variables. So those are two that I would recommend. Contexts if you want something just quick. Redux if you want to do it in the right way, that it will be easier to sort of track down for other developers later on.
Good answer. Thank you. And someone else actually just asked something as well. Hey, John, should I go Flow or TypeScript?
Well, I feel like I have to say Flow, having worked for Facebook. I'm probably biased at this point because I've spent so much time in the past like 6 months converting things to Flow and adding Flow, and I just think it's wonderful. But I can't say I really know like the particular difference that makes one better over the other. I think in this sort of argument, it's more just choose one and stick with it. So here was what I'll say. It seems obvious at Facebook to do this, but if you're a startup and you're interested in hiring talent and trying to find a lot of talent out there that you may be adding your pool, there's probably more people who know TypeScript and are interested in working on TypeScript. And so for me, I think if I were starting up a company right now and I was interested in finding talent, I'd probably stick with TypeScript for that reason. It might make it easier to hire.
Good. We have another question from another chat, which it cuts off. So I'll read the question to you with the remaining words. So what do you think about manual rendering by using state? Assume that we are not using state in our HTML. I'm using a JS variable somewhere else. So when my JS variable changes, I want to render, basically. That's what it says.
Yeah. I guess the first lesson that I mentioned in this whole talk was use state management right off the bat. And so it makes you wonder, in what scenarios would you not want to use state management? In what scenario can you just render things based off some JavaScript variable that's changing here and there, instead of having some big old system that you need to implement? And I think there maybe is a few use cases. Like if you have some landing page that you just want somebody's email and you just want to trigger like thanks for signing up. In that case, maybe staying away from a state management system makes sense. But my general idea is anytime I've built a project in the past, it's started out simple and gotten more and more and more complex to the point that if I didn't add state management in the beginning, I wish I had. And so what I would think about manual rendering, I would say try to find a state management system that works for your use case. I don't know if that really answers the question. I may not have understood it perfectly, so feel free to ask differently if I didn't.
Like you said, if I'm sure they'll follow up if whether or not they're happy with that answer. We have another question. I didn't expect to do questions now, but we have so much time left that we might.
Yeah, as well. I guess I didn't expect to run through this talk really quick.
It seems to be a running theme. We're constantly ahead of time, so. Dear audience, please continue asking questions. We've got all the time in the world, so please go ahead. So next question. Will TypeScript someday be a part of ECMA script?
I'm not the right person to ask that question, but I believe I remember searching for that myself and seeing in the like ECMAScript documentation that they had that in the plan. And so I would recommend just Google searching that and looking for documentation. I think they have future plans in their documentation, and they even have release dates. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My guess would be yes.
Sounds good. So I'm thinking I have 5 questions in front of me. Should we do them now or should? or should we save them for later? What do you reckon? Um, I guess we could ask them now, couldn't we?
Yeah,
Huh.
just in case you see me looking on the side, I'm reading some of the notes that I made for myself just to see if there was anything else that I didn't mention that I'd like to add.
No
But
worries at
I'm
all.
open to just tossing out questions.
Oh, good. There's questions popping up. Okay, so next one. Can you share any thoughts about React Server components?
Um, I'll say just in general, I mentioned that when it comes to state management, it's important to just understand the concepts, because if you go to like 4 or 5 different systems, just having those concepts can help you pick them up really quick. And even when it comes to server-side components, regardless of React, I think I'm a big fan of server-side components in general, no matter what the front-end framework is. I think at I worked at this company, Branch International. I didn't mention that during the talk because Branch actually didn't use React at all, but we made a heavy investment there into server-side components for our Android application. And that was awesome. That was a big deal. And the biggest deal there, I guess, was that for the Android applications, let me back up. We would release new code and deploy our code to production every like 45 minutes at this company. It was amazing. They had just wonderful like continuous integration. But when it comes to the Android app, it was like every month. And this was because we wanted to be really careful not to create things that weren't backward compatible, because so many of our users had old applications from years and years ago. So when we made this transition to server-side components, it allowed us to make tons of changes that otherwise would have taken a month or two, because we were worried about it being not backward compatible. But in this case, we we're like, oh, well, let's just change the server-side component rendering, and then we can have a whole different front-end display for that user. So I'm a huge fan of server-side rendering in general as a concept, regardless of whether it's at React.
Great. More questions. So Marta asks, will TypeScript stay with us, or is it just a temporary trend? What's your opinion?
I would be really sad to see TypeScript go. I feel like there's been a few other strongly typed languages that the fact that TypeScript comes to mind so prevalently, and when I look at all these companies that have job descriptions, they're advertising, they have TypeScript, and when I talk with friends who are running companies, they're implementing it. It seems like something that's going to stick around for a while. Will it stay with us? There's no date there. So will it stay with us for the next 500 years? Who knows? Probably not. Will it stay with us for the next 5? Yeah, probably. So I think it's a worthy investment.
Good. It's funny that I'm moderating this for my colleague Anna, and I'm organizing essentially a rival summit on Vue. So everything all of you guys are saying, I'm like, okay, that's great. So, also, please buy your tickets for Vue. But we'll come back to that. I will be making an announcement later on. But okay, next question. What about backend solutions for React?
Well, I might not be the right person to ask for this. I think my perception of React is that it's built to be a front-end framework that should be agnostic to a backend solution. I will say there's been a few times that I've tried to create a Ruby on Rails backend application using React on the front end that I feel like I've hit the wall, and I'm just like, why isn't this working? It is not meant to work super well with Ruby on Rails, and maybe that's changed since I did it. Let's see, the times that I've used React has been mostly with like Python Django or some custom implementation more than Ruby on Rails. So I would just say, yeah, the only comment that I have there would be if you're using Ruby on Rails, it's probably going to take a upfront investment of getting that integration. I know they have a number of different commands that are supposed to set it up properly, but it just hasn't worked for me in the past very well.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. So I'm just thinking out loud. I think too much of a good thing isn't necessarily great. So even though I still have questions for you and we still have the time for it, I do think I should save those questions for later. Oh, there goes another one. Question. What do you think about using Redux structure, reducers, actions with hooks and context? Never mind, just forget everything I just said.
Using Redux structures with hooks and context. Huh. I don't know. I don't think I have the right answer for that. So forgive me for just giving my best try here, but I think it's not really designed to, I feel like my experience using hooks and context is not designed to use Redux structures. And so it feels like if I were doing that, it's probably just because I've spent a lot of time in Redux and I'm trying to morph something that I know into what it's supposed to be. So just my immediate assumption would be that this is probably not the right approach, and we should read the documentation and read examples and find out how this is supposed to be. I bet you there's a ton of like how-to documents out on the internet that say hooks and context for Redux users. That's specifically designed to like people who think this way and who are used to this structure. Here's an example of how to do it. Maybe what you were getting at, Elena, was that I liked the particular structure of Redux, and hooks and context don't necessarily require that. And so if you use that same structure, it could have the best of both worlds. And I like that argument. If that's the argument you were making, that would be great.
So we'll see what Elena says. The person actually that asked you about the backend solutions for React says, thank you for your answer. And we have another question from someone else saying, what about picking a CSS framework to work with React?
I'm not the right person to ask for a CSS framework. Whenever I've built applications from the ground up, I just kind of find what's new and popular out there at the moment. I think right now I'm using Xstyle a whole bunch, and we're trying to remove all CSS. I've used Foundation in the past that I personally really liked that, but I don't have a great suggestion. I'd say whatever works for your use case. I don't think you're gonna have a hard time hiring one developer over the other from that, and I don't particularly see like a year down the road being really upset because you chose a particular CSS framework.
So, okay, unless the audience keeps asking questions,
Yeah.
I'll ask one more question.
Oh,
Never mind. We just got a question. This is wonderful. I'm actually really enjoying this. So
I see the question here by Adolfo.
Yes, it's on screen as well. So any
awesome.
advice about how to organize your components by folders and names to accomplish what you said before? Find them easily. Thank you.
Let's see. Any advice I give on a particular naming convention would just be my own personal experience. But if I can try to abstract that to general advice, I would say I want my components to be highly specialized, as I mentioned before. So I'm okay with a really long name. I'm fine with that. Some people think, oh, this has got 30 letters. This is horrible. And I'm like, that's totally fine with me. If that helps me find my components, I'm okay with that. I am okay with having like 300 files in a folder, which sounds a little strange sometimes. But as long as I'm able to quickly find that file when I'm searching for it, that's fine with me.
Is that your final answer?
I guess as a developer, I want to be able to read the path of folders and the file and know exactly what the file does. I shouldn't even have to look at the code. I'm a big fan of test plans and file paths that I don't even have to look at the code. If I read the test, I know what this whole system does. If I read the path and the file name, it should make sense what it does. If I then go into the file and there's a thing there that does what it says and there's another thing, those should be two files. That's my opinion.
Great. Okay. Um, Different question. How would you organize your Redux folders? My company wants us to group reducers, constants, actions, and store together, and separate folder for action types. Would you agree with this structure?
It's when they say here, let me read this.
Okay.
In a separate folder for action types. So separate folder for action types makes me believe that they have a single folder for the reducers, constants, actions, and store together. And that seems to me like an overuse of that particular folder. Why not have a folder for each of those? I don't think it hurts in any way. So that seems fine. I like the fact that you have those all separated already in different files. In terms of a folder structure, I personally would say create your reducers into a folder and your constants maybe one up above that, and your actions into a folder and your store there too. And so again, when I read that folder path, it should say my app, my feature, this like state management, my store, and then the name of the store. And you're like, oh, this is the store for that feature for that app. That makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Honestly, you and I are on fire. The questions just keep rolling in. I thought we would have ended ages ago. This is fantastic. So, next question. Is it better to use CRA or build things from scratch?
So I don't know what CRA is, but in
Okay,
general,
so
I think maybe we can paraphrase this to just, is it better to use an existing application or existing component or build something from scratch? Is that all right if I make that assumption?
yeah, yeah.
I find it really depends on the business and your time.
Oh, I'm
Like,
sorry. The person just,
yep.
or another person said it's create React app. That's what it is.
Oh, okay. Oh, thanks.
Oh, actually, the comments are just blowing up. Everyone's saying that. So we both
All right.
learned something new today.
All right. I guess I clearly haven't like started from scratch in a while, as opposed to just coming in and working on existing applications. But all right, is it better to use Create React App versus from scratch? Every time that I have created from scratch, I've used a Create React App command. But from my memory, when I last did that, there was like 30 or so different commands to choose from that had different frameworks and templates. It wasn't like there was just one that I had to choose. In that command, there was a bunch of different options. I was fine with that. I think starting from scratch seems a little ambitious, but I mean, if you consider yourself to be an expert, you know exactly what in those template React apps that you don't need, and you know exactly what you do need, then go for it. Great, more power to you.
Great. Next question about
Everybody's clarifying.
I know the comments are just about.
I guess something you never want to do as a speaker. It's like, I don't know what that is, but thanks everybody
But
for
we're all
allowing me to be
human,
humble. Yeah.
right? Yeah, it's definitely a reality check, isn't it? So, about testing in Facebook, besides Jest, are there any other OSS technologies?
Not that I know of. I use Jest for all of my testing, and so testing. Oh, in Facebook specifically.
Yeah, Facebook.
I'm sure there are, but the only ones that I use are Jest. There's got to be like 50 or 60 different testing frameworks that I've seen. I mean, I just wrote some tests in C# recently, and that was a real headache. Everything was customized, but when it comes to testing in JavaScript, the Jest tests are pretty robust, so I just use those. I'm going to just real quickly review. Yeah, I don't think that there was anything else in my lessons that I wanted to share. So how are we doing? It looks like the questions are dying down a little bit.
So there's another one that I definitely want to ask, which is this one. And then I think they're dying down for now. Any advice for architecture or structure in terms of folders for a basic starter project, i.e. services, core, data, etc.?
Well, even though I was just saying, oh, I don't know what CRA is, if I can just reflect back on my experience from creating applications from scratch, it's usually been, I'm going to go as a starter, read like 4 or 5 of these to do like how to demo apps that usually is 30 minutes to an hour of each of them. I'm going to pick out which Create React app starts, and from there, it usually gives me a folder structure. In terms of data, I think, if you're talking about backend data in which database to use, that's sort of a whole nother topic. But in terms of state management, we talked about that. I think I'm a fan of Redux, and I think it's very simple to implement that with a lot of these starter applications. In services, I don't know, just a personal preference. I have a folder that I tend to call services, that this is a service that is reaching out to a separate service outside of my application. And so I just personally tend to name things a service when it happens to interface with something outside of my app. But I don't know if that's relevant to this. My main advice here would be find one of those Create React app scripts that work for you and stick with that folder structure until you find something that you like better.
Okay. There's another question. It seems like no one wants you to go. Okay, possibly last question. In your 4 companies, what was the best CSS approach that worked, that was the easiest to maintain and use? Was it CSS in JS, CSS global files, or Tailwind/Bootstrap class dumping style?
So I caveat, I do generally consider myself a backend engineer more than a front-end engineer. And so I don't tend to spend a lot of time in CSS and CSS frameworks, but from just my personal experience, anytime I found that there was inline CSS in files, it's been sort of a headache. So I do like when I have like an XCSS file or some sort of compiled CSS that has variables that I can reference everywhere in my application. So I prefer, I guess, these global files that are compiled, that have variables that I can embed things into. So instead of saying like, here's this one CSS thing that I need to add another one, I want to be able to embed rules that says for this particular page, for this application, for this component, for this thing, here's what the CSS should be. And that also allows me to test that component very nicely. So I feel like I just sort of threw up a little bit of advice there, but hopefully that helps. Anything that you can add in a variable that you can reference around, and anything that you can pull outside of an inline application. Like if you find yourself saying style, like in HTML, if you add style equals, display bold, like, okay, that you need to figure out a way to get that out, in my personal experience.
Okay, so for sure, last question, because we have a Q&A soon, and I have an announcement to make before that. So last question, everybody, please continue asking John questions, but save them for the Q&A. That's actually more of a mental note to myself. But last question, any advice to split component business logic, connections with Redux store and presentation? So FE container, component business logic, and component view is okay?
Okay, so I will say, from my experience, I found a lot of people, including at Facebook, shift towards these functional components that remove a lot of the business logic and just tries to keep, here's just the thing that's rendering, and here's a few, like when we, as I've sort of, well, let's see, is this just for Redux store presentation? I guess my answer is relevant to hooks, but as we've sort of made a shift to hooks, it's made it a lot easier to do this, to create these functional components where it's very easy to separate out business logic. You can take a whole function that's meant to do something specific, pull it into a separate file, and then you've got just your functional component that maybe calls that file. So in general, I am a fan of separating business logic and connections with Redux store and presentations from just component rendering. I do think I am a fan of the shift towards hooks and making things just render what they need to, as opposed to a component that manages all of its logic as well.
Okay, great. So Black Dots, I see your last question, but I'll save that for the Q&A because I need to give John like 2 minutes to breathe. I'll make an announcement and then we will see everyone very, very, very shortly for the Q&A, actually in 5 minutes. So John, have a cup of tea or something, relax for 5 minutes, and
thanks everybody for the flurry of questions. It's been wonderful. As you can probably tell from me, I don't feel totally qualified to necessarily answer all of these, but I hope you can appreciate me just trying to provide my personal experience, as this was the case study festival. And hopefully those 4 lessons, even though we went through them really quick, are things that will help you save some mental pain later on when you're realizing, oh wow, this would have been really bad if I had if I hadn't created new stores, or if I hadn't done the strongly typed early on, or if I hadn't created state management. So my best wishes to everybody in the chat. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. See you soon.